Welcome to Act 2 of Deconstructing Directing, our directing identity. I'm Andrew Robler, the founder and archivist here. Act 1 explored a new paradigm for defining what a director does, and this act is all about exploring who a director is and how we develop and hone our sense of self as directors. I can imagine that some folks might wonder why we're focusing on definitions and identities in these first two acts instead of diving into the nuts and bolts of directing. And this first scene here in Act 2, Understanding Our Why, will hopefully answer that question in detail. The short explanation is this. When we take action without understanding why we are doing it, we increase the risk of harm to ourselves and those we are responsible for. The reality that directing has no clear pathway for training or professional development in the American theater means that there has not been sufficient field-wide conversation around the work of directing. Hence why directors can so easily perpetuate harm, whether intentionally or unintentionally. We need to understand our why. But before we can really dive into understanding our why, we need to understand what a why is and why our why matters. Let's start with the what. Simply put, a why is a purpose, a mission, a vision, or a statement of values. You can pick the phrasing that's most meaningful to you. Whys exist at every level of our society, from the macro level, like the whys behind war, treaties, and independence, to the micro level, like the why behind our clothing choice on a given day. As directors, we work with and ask for whys all the time, though we may not always use the word why to do so. Asking an actor what their character wants from another? That's a why. Asking our scenic designer to explain their color palette choice? That's a why. Presenting our concept of the show to a producer or our production team? That is also a why. But in this particular instance, we're not talking about the why behind a company or organization, nor are we talking about the why behind a particular show choice or concept. Instead, the why we are interested in here is our personal why as directors. Why are we, or why do we want to be directors? We can, of course, broaden this question a bit more to ask why we make art and tell stories. These whys are often related. You may notice a similarity here to a dramatic concept popularized by Konstantin Stanislavski, the superobjective. A superobjective is the overarching goal of a character in a play or story, usually an intangible goal like to be loved or to have agency. When I work with actors, I sometimes joke that characters are a lot less complicated than real people because we don't have just one single superobjective. And while I still think that's mostly true, I've come to realize that we humans aren't perhaps as complicated as we think. While one why rarely drives every facet of our lives, in different contexts we often have a dominant purpose or goal, and in those contexts it is not unlike a superobjective. When working with actors, a superobjective can be helpful because it becomes a measuring stick against which they can determine the effectiveness of choices they are making. If the character's superobjective is that they want to be loved, it may give us pause if the actor chooses to deliver a line in a way that makes that objective more difficult to reach. Often it becomes a discussion point, a flag that tells us to look closely at it. Sometimes we need to change the choice, and sometimes the choice reveals that the superobjective is different than we thought. This, then, is why a why matters. When we fail to clearly define why something matters to us, or why we are taking particular actions, it's not unlike driving around without a map or GPS. If it's a really familiar area, we may be fine, but as soon as we realize that we don't know where we are or where we're going, emotions like anxiety and anger can begin to rise, impacting not only our relationships with others in the car with us, but also our ability to pay attention to hazards in the road like a pothole or a bicyclist. And as we explored in Act 1, defining directing, a director has a lot of responsibilities. So we're not just driving, we're also trying to carry on a conversation with the other folks in the car, trying to find the right radio station, and also get us to where we're going. It's a pretty clear recipe for disaster if the driver is doing all of that while their anxiety and frustration are spiking. Our why isn't just the destination, it's also in part the roadmap, the guiding star that helps us make sure we aren't betraying ourselves and who we want to be for the sake of a process or product. That is why our why matters. Okay, so if we accept that our why really matters, How do we find it? Especially if we're a director who has been pushed into the role out of necessity or lack of other options. I'm thinking about the athletic coach who got pulled in to direct the one-act play, or the English teacher that got told that they need to teach the theater class this year because of budget cuts, or the community theater board member who got tapped to step in and direct a show because the director dropped at the last minute. Especially in those situations, it can be easy to skip right past our why because it feels like our why has been defined for us. We've been told to do it, or if we don't do it, then the show doesn't happen. That's our why, right? As frustrating as it is to be in that situation, the reality is that if we allow those external forces to define our why, we leave room for resentment to grow, which is toxic for us and for everyone around us. To be clear, I'm not suggesting that we should not acknowledge the feelings of anger, frustration, or even fear that might manifest when we are pushed into a situation we don't want to be in. Those feelings are valid, and if we try to completely suppress them, they will eventually express themselves in a way that is much harder for us to control. Instead, what I'm suggesting is that when we are pushed into a leadership role like that of directing a production, it is essential that we find an internally motivated why and acknowledge and process our emotions. If self-regulating your emotions is a challenge for you, the final scene in this act will go over a number of practical tips for developing our emotional regulation skills. Okay, so we can acknowledge the importance of a why, but how in the world do we figure out what ours is? Our why is always about our impact, and the impact of interpersonal relationships, such as directing, can often best be defined by looking at others. This is not to say that there's not a personal or internal impact we can and should consider as well, but when defining a why to communicate to others on our team, considering the impact on others is key. We can consider questions like, what do I want people who have worked with me on this production to say about working with me at the end of it? What do I want the people working on this production to think, feel, or say about the project itself at the end of it? What are the parts of who I am as a person, or my why, if the Friends exercise was completed, talk about that in a minute, that could find enjoyment in this project? What do I want the people working with me on this project to say about those parts of me when we are done? I'm partial to an exercise described by Sinek, an author and motivational speaker that helps take it out of our heads a little bit. I'll put a link to the short YouTube video of him describing it below in the description if you're watching this on YouTube or listening to the podcast, or on the scene page if you're watching this on our website. It may not be immediately apparent how this relates to directing, but hang in there with me and I'll connect it back. The first step is to find someone who knows you well and with whom you have a strong connection. Importantly, you want to avoid people that feel an obligation to you out of blood or marriage, like a family member or a spouse. Ideally, you want to find someone who chooses to connect with you in the environment where you feel most alive. The second step is to ask them a seemingly simple question. Why are we friends? If they struggle to answer, you might follow it up with, what specifically is it about me that means you would be there for me no matter what? It's very likely that when you ask them this question, they will tell you things about yourself, like you're a good listener or you're a kind person. The third step is perhaps the hardest, but if they do answer by describing things about you, your response needs to discount those descriptions. That's just the definition of a friend. What specifically is it about me that means you are friends with me? Or lots of people are good listeners. Why are you and I specifically friends? Or there are lots of kind people. Why are you friends with me in particular? Note that this can be frustrating for your friends, so you may want to give them a heads up that you need to have an important conversation that may be a bit frustrating. As you continue to push back on their answers that focus on you, eventually they will shift to describing themselves. They will describe what being your friend means to them. It might sound something like, when I sit in a room with you, you make me feel like nothing else matters other than me. Or, when I'm down, I know that you will always be able to make me laugh. When they get to that point, they are describing what draws them to you, and that is at least part of your why. Sinek specifically mentions it bringing up an emotional response, though I think that will depend in part on your own relationship with emotion. And this connects to directing because our whys in different avenues of life are often, if not always, connected. Understanding what drives you as an individual will necessarily help you understand what drives you as a director, because it gets at a core element of who you are, which we'll explore in Act 2, Scene 2. That said, it's okay if this particular exercise feels too vulnerable and too personal. The questions we discussed before are another great way to begin exploring our why as directors. Now, sometimes when we first start defining our why, it's not easy to boil it down to a single sentence. Sometimes it's a description of a feeling, a story of an experience that is similar to what you hope to experience on the project in question, or a series of fragments and ideas. That is okay. The important thing isn't to have a perfect definition or description, it's to step away from the external forces that led us to being in the role of a director and start to understand that we have the ability to define a why even in circumstances that might not be ideal. And if we chose to direct or are super excited to direct, that why is just as valuable because we need to be able to communicate it. Which brings us to the last part of this scene, communicating our why. In Act 1, Scene 2, about facilitation/translation, we talked about the importance of specificity in communication, especially in the theater world, where assumptions tend to reign supreme. We even dove into resources like an About the Director document to help collaborators of all kinds understand who you are and what matters to you. Being able to clearly define why you are directing, not why this show excites you, but why you are stepping into the role of a director, means that you can share this information with your team. Of course, it doesn't have to be in writing, especially if you don't have a nice, neat way to talk about your why yet, but clarity around your why is what helps others buy in. Going back to Simon Sinek, his 2009 book Start With Why and the associated TEDx talk, linked in the usual spots, both introduce the idea that when we can lead from our why instead of our what or our how, we are able to attract collaborators who are invested at a much deeper level than they might otherwise be. If I'm directing a production of the musical Pippin, and the fact that we're doing that particular show is all I rely on to attract collaborators, they will bring their own whys to the project. And if those whys don't align with mine, that's when conflict happens. If instead I'm able to start by defining my why, I will be able to attract collaborators who want to work with me, not just work on this particular show. Then it doesn't matter as much what show we're doing because our point of connection is deeper than that. And they will be more likely to go with me if I have an out there idea that conflicts with their own understanding of that particular show. This shift in thinking and the effort that it takes to be self-aware and really understand your own motivations when it comes to the work of directing, whether you chose to take the role or it was thrust upon you, will yield many more positive outcomes than if you forgo this process. To use our earlier analogy, this is why it's like your GPS, helping you stay focused on the people in the process rather than getting lost in the process itself. And clearly communicating your why to your team helps to ensure that everyone in the car with you is willing to pitch in if you lose signal and get lost anyway, because they share a commitment to the why. So if you're ready to discover your own why, there are worksheets on the website in the usual place, as well as links to Simon Sinek's YouTube videos that we referenced both in the description and on the website. If you are not a Patreon member and want to be, you can earn fun perks like stickers, monthly hangouts and Q&A sessions with me, and more for helping to support this project financially. But none of this content will ever live behind a paywall. So if you can't or don't want to join the Patreon, don't worry, you'll still get all of Deconstructing Directing completely free. I'll see you again when you're ready to dive into Act 2, Scene 2, Imposter Syndrome and Directing. Until then, my fellow storytellers, I challenge us all to be recklessly kind.